This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Michael Federici, Alexander Hamilton, and Professor Federici's new book, The Political Philosophy of Alexander Hamilton. Professor Federici is chairman of the Department of Political Science at Mercyhurst University, and he is the author of Eric Voegelin, The Restoration of Order, and The Challenge of Populism, The Rise of Right-Wing Democratism in Post-War America. Professor Federici, glad to have you today.
Thanks for having me.
Let me ask you, so you've written a book on the political philosophy of Alexander Hamilton, and yet there is certainly no shortage of scholarship on Alexander Hamilton's constitutional thought, his understanding of political economy, his famous fundamental debate over the American polity with Thomas Jefferson, to say nothing of biographies that have been done on Hamilton's life. So let me ask you a basic question. Why did you write this book? What did you hope to achieve with it?
There's two parts to the answer. The first one is the book is part of a series that Johns Hopkins University Press has done on the political philosophy of the American founders. And prior to the publication of my book on Hamilton, they've done books on Jefferson, on Ben Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Paine, James Madison. And when they were looking for someone to do the Hamilton book, my name was thrown out there and I was asked to submit a proposal. And it was at that time, to get to my second point, that I had to consider, does it make sense to do this? Because Hamilton is someone who, when you talk to historians especially, they'll tell you he's been overdone. So much literature out there on him, so why another book? But what I discovered is that there isn't that much out there on Hamilton's political theory. There's a great deal on his biography, and there's a great deal on historical stuff, but not a lot on his political ideas or his political thinking.
Okay. So let me ask you, you make a statement early in the book that Alexander Hamilton, amongst the primary founders, is exceptional, that he is distinct. His political philosophy, his constitutionalism, his understanding of the rule of law, separation of powers, his understanding of judiciary. So let me ask you, why do you make that statement? I mean, and one way to think of it is just from our late modern perspective, it will certainly seem to be the case that Hamilton, Madison, Thomas Jefferson, others would actually have far more in common with one another than they would with actually most late modern political thinkers. And so if you could kind of flesh that out. I thought that was a very curious statement.
Hamilton, remember, writes most of the Federalist Papers, and if there's one place that we go to look for the framers' insights on theoretical questions regarding principles of American constitutionalism, it is the Federalist Papers. And that, in some respects, is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Hamilton's work, because embedded in his speeches, in his letters, in his public papers are all sorts of other statements that explain really the theoretical foundation for many of the ideas you read about in the Federalist Papers. What does he think of the nature of man and the human condition? What does he think of human society? What does he think are the possibilities of politics? You know, Hamilton is a deeper thinker than he's often given credit for being. Most people, when they think of Hamilton, think about his report on manufacturing, his argument in favor of the National Bank. But even when he's making those arguments, there are deeper theoretical aspects, dimensions to what's there. And I don't think that those deeper theoretical aspects have been really brought out in the secondary literature as much as they might, or if they have, they've often been misinterpreted.
You have a chapter on, you call it Hamilton's philosophical anthropology. We could say human nature, maybe. And I thought that was actually a great chapter because you situate Hamilton at the crossroads of Enlightenment thought, but also classical philosophical wisdom and also Christianity and a Christian understanding of human nature and how that would relate to politics. Let me ask you this question. Is this another way to understand Hamilton's distinctness, his understanding of human nature?
Yes. And what I tried to do at the start of my research, the way I went about it is I read Hamilton's works first before I jumped into the secondary literature. I knew a little bit about the secondary literature, but not nearly as much as I did when I got finished with my research. But I started with Hamilton. I didn't want the secondary literature to prejudice me. And what I found when I went through Hamilton's work and then got into the secondary literature is these great debates take place among people who are trying to classify Hamilton as an Enlightenment thinker, as someone influenced by the classics, as a Whig, as a Tory. There are all sorts of categories out there, and arguments are made to fit him in one or the other. And he gets placed into so many different and variegated categories, you wonder how that can be if people are reading the same literature. I think the reason why he gets placed in so many different categories in the secondary literature is because he's a somewhat enigmatic thinker. He's not easily classified, and yet what authors are trying to do when they're writing about his political ideas is they're trying to put him into a category. So what I try and do is not force him into a category where he doesn't belong and say, in essence, well, he belongs in a bunch of different categories, that you shouldn't say he's only an Enlightenment thinker, or he's only influenced by the classics, or he's just a Whig, or he's just a Tory. He's a little bit of a lot of different things.
On this question of human nature, you write at great length about Hamilton not being a ahistorical thinker, someone who isn't using a philosophical construct or an abstraction to understand human nature, and also how human beings govern themselves or should be governed. That's not the mode of his analysis. It's historical experience. Why historical experience? Is Hamilton, can we say he's Burkean in that aspect, or what does he glean from history in terms of understanding how men should be ruled, but also republicanism and the importance of republicanism? One thing in particular, I think of the historical experience, does he fall prey to historicism and the problems with that idea?
Okay, that's a big question. Let me try to unpack it bit by bit. Hamilton is certainly influenced by thinkers like Hume, and he's very similar to Burke in that whatever language you use, empiricism is a loaded term, but I would prefer to use the term of being historical, which is to say, when Hamilton is measuring the claims that are made about politics, about human nature, about even the course of government, human experience is the standard that he uses to measure the claims that are made, to measure the prudence of policies that are being proposed. And it gives his political ideas a richness, a historical richness that you don't find in some other thinkers who tend to be more historically abstract. And when you think about the debate and the contrast between Jefferson and Hamilton, to me, this is the core of the difference between the two, is that while Jefferson read history and understood history, there's a large element to his thought that is rather abstract. And anyone who reads through a good deal of Jefferson's writings sees that abstraction because he's speculating about things like liberty and rights, and even in the Declaration of Independence, in a way that's somewhat abstract. Hamilton tends not to be abstract at all, and it's one of the reasons why it's nearly impossible to make connections between Hamilton's political theory and social contract theory. There are very few theories that are as abstract, historically abstract, as social contract theory. It starts from an ahistorical state of nature, something Hamilton had no affinity for, and from there it talks about the foundation of a political society in abstraction, that people somehow, out of their reason and rationality, conceive of a society that is in no way tied to historical things, no way tied to the actual historical development of a society. That way of thinking, while it's present in Jefferson, is nowhere to be found in Hamilton. And I was struck by that when I went through Hamilton's writing, just how historically concrete his thinking was.
Yeah, it's interesting. You use a term a couple of times in the book, the unwritten Constitution, which I thought was instructive in this regard in his thinking about the coming together, the shaping, the historical formation of the American Union, moving from colonial development into something of a union for purposes of independence, to gain independence, to try and fight and pull resources together. But then also the Constitution and its strong power, which Hamilton urges, that it gives to the federal government. There has to be the power to tax, to directly tax, is tremendous. Also, the Commerce Clause power is also instructive. But let me ask you the question of Hamilton, and we're talking about the abstraction, not arguing against abstraction as a basis of political thought, and yet, in terms of historical formation, he prefers the federal government. I think we can make a statement. He thinks the federal government is going to be the key to the Union. How does he make that move? Because you would think historically you might be more Jeffersonian in the sense of that the states matter, and the states need to retain huge pieces of their sovereignty. How does that work out?
Well, I mean, that's a wonderful follow-up question because it allows me to go back and emphasize something in my previous answer, and that is when Hamilton is faced at the Constitutional Convention, and even prior to that, when he begins thinking about what's the best form of government in America, he is not at all abstract about it. And the irony is that many of the Jeffersonians have cast Hamilton in such a way that he was some kind of ideological advocate of monarchy, that regardless of the circumstance and the place, monarchy was the best form of government, and even beyond that, British monarchy was the best form of government and the best form of government for America. There is absolutely no foundation for that reading of Hamilton if you look at what he actually said and what he actually wrote. Hamilton does not advocate monarchical government for America. He thinks it's appropriate in England, but this is precisely why he's a historical thinker and thinks that human experience and circumstances matter. In one set of circumstances in England, monarchy may be a perfectly legitimate form of government, but in another set of circumstances in America, Hamilton understands monarchy will not work. We don't have the classes, we don't have the heritage, we don't have the history. It would make no sense to create a monarchy in America. And as I point out in the book, at various times when the nation seems to be susceptible to a military coup, like the Newburgh conspiracy that may lead to something like monarchy, Hamilton opposes it over and over and over again. He is not an advocate of monarchy in America. He's an advocate of Republican government time and time again. And that's something I think that my book makes clear from the evidence. And that's different when you compare Hamilton to someone like, say, Thomas Paine, who rejects monarchy as a legitimate form of government in the abstract. In other words, we don't need to know what the circumstances are. Monarchy is never a legitimate form of government. So Paine, like Jefferson, they are ideologically opposed to that form of government, whereas Hamilton is open to the possibility that one form of government may work in one place but not somewhere else.
So this, I thought that's interesting. This also helps us understand the statement that Hamilton is, repeatedly criticized for in the Constitutional Convention. I think it was the Constitutional Convention. He made the statement that monarchical government in Britain is nearly the best government we have on earth. But of course, that could be true, and it can still also be true that he's talking about, yes, because of their political, historical, social circumstances, it works. And we can appreciate it and admire it, but it's not something that we need to emulate. So I appreciate that. One of the interesting things you mentioned in the book is kind of a discrete historical episode I didn't know about, and that is, I think there were Sons of Liberty mobs in the early stages of the war, rampaging in New York, and you mentioned the Isaac Sears raid, and they kidnap a minister who was a Loyalist, Samuel Seabury. They also try and kidnap a man named David Rivington, and James Rivington, I apologize. They try and kidnap him, they fail, and they go back and smash his press. And this was an important, it seems to be an important moment for Hamilton in reflecting on human nature and political power. He's frequently, you mentioned monarchy, but he also someone who thought that we could not trust people with political power. There had to be someone really directly sitting on them and controlling them. And it seems like this episode illuminates part of Hamilton's thought. And he writes a letter after the mob smashed the press to John Jay. And I wanted to quote from it and get you to follow up on it. Hamilton says, and I quote, "In times of such commotion as the present, while the passions of men are worked up to an uncommon pitch, there is great danger of fatal extremes. The same state of the passions which fits the multitude, who have not a sufficient stock of reason and knowledge to guide them for opposition to tyranny and oppression, very naturally leads them to a contempt and disregard of all authority. The due medium is hardly to be found among the more intelligent. It is almost impossible among the unthinking populace. In such, and skipping down, in such tempestuous times, it requires the greatest skill in the political pilots to keep men steady and within proper bounds, on which account I am always more or less alarmed at everything which is done of mere will and pleasure without any proper authority.
That's a wonderful quote, I think. At a very early point, if I remember correctly, Hamilton is something like 20 years old when he makes that statement. And you see there the foundation for his political thinking that he consistently follows for the rest of his life. And that is, more than anything, he fears anarchy. And he's concerned in the context of revolution. It's not so much a fear of what the people will do with power, but it's what a mob will do with power. It's when all restraint, institutional restraint, including government, has disappeared from the landscape and human beings are basically free to do whatever their desires will lead them to do, that Hamilton says human beings are at their worst. So while he joins the Patriots, roughly a year after he's been in the country, and he becomes an American very quickly, fights in the war bravely, spends most of his time on Washington's staff during the war. There's no question about his commitment and loyalty to the United States. He's also very skeptical about what the Sons of Liberty and what mobs are doing to undermine the foundation for order and authority, political authority included, in America. And he's worried that as these patriot mobs go around, harassing and even tyrannizing Tories, that's going to carry over into the period when the revolution is over and government has to be established. And they're now in the mood of thinking that this is the way you can behave outside of the parameters and constraints of authority.
I wanted to ask you, also in this score, we're talking about the Loyalist. Hamilton, after the war, will defend Loyalists as clients, as a lawyer who will take them on and defend their property from unjust confiscation in the state of New York. And he appeals to, I think you said, general international law for this proposition, but also the treaty that we had ratified for the protection of property and the reimbursement of property. Also, another interesting part of Hamilton, I thought, the slave brigade. That he is responsible for putting together, and which will give the slaves freedom once they're emancipated. These are parts of Hamilton that I didn't know about, but I thought were interesting. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but it seems to indicate a part of his character. Also, let me ask you a follow-up question on human nature. You spend some time talking about religion and Christianity. Hamilton, not pious, we could say, but observant. That's kind of what I gleaned. But also, this does inform his understanding of politics. And is this through the notion of original sin and man's limitation and fallenness, or are there other parts as well?
Let me take the question about slavery first. Over the last few decades, a great deal of attention has been paid to the fact that the American framers, many of them were slaveholders, advocates of slavery, and this is a blemish on the founders' record and may even have placed into the Constitution some disease that makes the whole thing questionable. When Thurgood Marshall, during the bicentennial, the Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, during the bicentennial celebration of the Constitution, really disparaged the framers in large part because they didn't adequately embrace the principle of equality as it exists in the 14th Amendment. He's ignoring, as have many of these other critics, that there are people like Hamilton that exist who are consistently opposed to slavery and opposed to slavery not just for political reasons, but on philosophical grounds. Hamilton saw blacks as his equal, and he never hesitated where he could. He belonged to manumission societies to do what he could to oppose slavery. It's not that at the Constitutional Convention he raised it as an issue, but back home in New York, which is where he belonged to those manumission societies, and working with his friend Lawrence, who was really the author of the plan to have a Negro regiment that would be freed after the war, Hamilton is unwavering in his opposition to slavery. Now, the second question connects in a way because his opposition to slavery, in my view, is no doubt connected to his Christianity. As a young man, and up until he attends Columbia University, he is rather pious. And even his writings as a young boy include all sorts of references to Bible and faith and God and the wrath of God and all sorts of things. Reverend Seabury is influential in developing his intellect and his imagination. And then Hamilton becomes busied with the war, and we don't see a lot of evidence in the historical record that he's pious in the sense of attending church and belonging to a parish and all the rest of it. But I think the story that's told about his death is somewhat telling in the role that religion played and his faith played in his life. Because when Hamilton is shot by Aaron Burr in the duel that takes his life, he knows immediately that he's done for, and he hangs on for roughly 24 hours. And in that period of time, we get a glimpse at what mattered to Hamilton most. His family. He wanted to make sure his wife, who knew nothing of the duel, was given some hope that he would recover. He was worried about his children and how they might react. And he was worried about the state of his soul. Someone who wasn't, in some respects, deeply connected to Christian faith would not have reacted that way. He insisted on receiving Holy Communion when he was denied more than once the opportunity to do so. He persisted until he did whatever he had to do to receive Holy Communion on his deathbed. And when he counseled his wife on his deathbed, he said, "Remember, Eliza, you are a Christian." There's something to me that indicates that Hamilton may have kept his faith a little close to his vest, but it was there and it's present in his political thinking, especially in his general view of human nature. He takes man as a fallen creature who is imperfectible, a largely Christian view.
I thought this was interesting as well in thinking of, I didn't realize how dire his situation was as a young boy in the West Indies in the island of St. Kitts, in the sense of his father leaves, he loses his mother, they're sent to relatives, the relatives commit suicide, if I remember correctly. Hamilton's, it seems to me his great fortune is his intellect, and you can see him being very valuable to his employer, and then through that, finding a way to come to America. I think it was a reverend on the island who you say supports his education. And it seemed to me actually to add something. I mean, I would say this will explain him through those circumstances, but to add to the way he thinks about the economy, to the way he thinks about liberty, and also even the slavery question. I mean, in a way, he's an American thoroughly, in a way that his Jeffersonian detractors are not. I mean, of course, their forefathers would have, in effect, created a wealthy life for them and have done something virtuous in that regard. But yet, they were men who came into this. Hamilton creates it for himself through hard work, through industry, through skill, through a dazzling intellect. I want to move and maybe shift and think about Hamilton and the Constitution, because this is obviously an important part of Hamilton. It's an important part of your book. And Hamilton's preeminency seems to me regarding the Constitution, things that you lay out, the executive branch and judicial review, the way he looks at enumerated powers in the Constitution. And you described that, I thought, very, very well. The executive power at this time, he's frequently seen maybe as the theoretical architect of the unitary executive in terms of current detractors. But yet, what's the understanding of executive power at this time in America, and how is he distinct, and what's he trying to achieve there?
To put the understanding of Hamilton's view of executive power into context, we have to remember that under the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive. It was a legislative branch only, no executive, no judiciary. So moving from the Articles to the Constitution looks in some respects more dramatic than I think it really is. But what became apparent, at least to most of the Federalists at the time of the Constitutional Convention, is we needed a separate branch of government that held executive power and a separate branch of government that held judicial power. So Hamilton was not unusual in arguing that we needed an executive branch. Where he varied from even most of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention is in arguing for a much stronger executive. And here, at times, it's difficult to know how much he may have exaggerated a bit for the purpose of effect and how much he was speaking from the heart and the mind and what he really believed in terms of executive power. But there is no doubt that Alexander Hamilton thought a strong, energetic executive was necessary for good government in America, that the execution of the laws depended on a strong, energetic executive, that the defense of the country depended on a strong, energetic executive. Which is not to say that the executive branch would be the place that would initiate policy when it came to domestic affairs, but for security and to some extent for regulation of economy, as we'll see later through the Treasury Department, Hamilton thought the executive branch would play a fundamental role.
Interesting. He emphasizes the independence of the executive. I think that's also a teachable lesson, I think, for us now. We tend to look at the executive as someone who embodies the people, embodies them in the sense of we worry greatly about his power and what he can do for us. He's our national representative. I don't take Hamilton to be making that point. He's making a point of the executive. If we think of Hamilton, he's a Republican, but he's also worried about what the people in a tumultuous moment might do. And the executive is the one who upholds the Constitution or upholds its, is a precautionary part of the Constitution. I think that's instructive. The judicial review, you speak about this, he's the one, we should say he authors, I think, 2/3 of the Federalist Papers. And judicial review is something Hamilton writes about. He also writes all of the essays on executive power. But I was curious, I had a thought as I was reading your book. You spend some time talking about the notion that Hamilton is a loose constructionist of the Constitution, and that in a way perhaps he's a forerunner to progressives. And you, I think correctly dispel that and put that to the side. Hamilton never advocated moving away from the text in sort of a free-floating way, the way we see in progressive jurisprudence. His point is, you note, there's an enumerated power. Inherently, there has to be the means to use that power, to execute it, to effectuate it. But I was wondering, and in particular the National Bank is instructive, is what does this mean for judicial review? Would judicial review necessarily be limited by that sort of understanding? And I think a lot of people might say this is a positive part of Hamilton, that inherently constitutionalism becomes political, becomes representatives in the public square making arguments about the goals, the structure of the Constitution. It's not something we just look to the courts to tell us what it means. It's not a legalistic constitutionalism. Does that seem to flow from his analysis of power?
There's no better statement on Hamilton's view of judicial review than what you find in Federalist Papers 78 and 81. He makes clear in those two papers these points. First, that it is precisely the role of the judiciary to strike down laws and government actions that are inconsistent with the Constitution. But when they do so, when they exercise that power of judicial review, they should not substitute their will for the people's will. And he makes clear what he means by the people's will is the Constitution. So if judges subvert the Constitution by saying, I don't like this law for ideological reasons, I don't like it for political reasons, then they have not only subverted the Constitution, but they've subverted the rule of law and they've subverted popular sovereignty. And he raises the very question. When he says that the judiciary is the least dangerous branch, he includes a qualification. He says as long as judicial power doesn't mix with legislative or executive power. In other words, if judges do substitute their will for the will of the people embedded in the Constitution, the judges are then making law, right? This is, in its most simple form, the definition of modern judicial activism. And Hamilton's answer to what to do with judges who would behave that way is in Federalist 81, and it is impeachment. And he says the power of impeachment will be a complete security against judicial encroachments on the legislative power. Those are Hamilton's words. No judicial activist or progressive loose constructionist talks like that. Hamilton talks like that repeatedly. He places great restraints on the use of judicial power. So his view is more like what you described. There are these enumerated powers in the Constitution, and if the Constitution gives to government that power, then it has to have the means, all means, in order to carry out those powers. But in terms of inventing powers that aren't there in the Constitution, you don't find anything like that in Alexander Hamilton's view of judicial power and judicial review.
It's interesting listening to you describe Hamilton's judicial philosophy. I'm also reminded, though, of originalism. And originalism, of course, has become a more, shall we say, differentiated body of thought, I think, in the last 10 years with the emphasis on construction and original meaning, et cetera. I wondered, though, Hamilton would not, if we could kind of come up with the more leading representatives of originalism, he wouldn't line up with them either. I mean, he's distinct in that regard. Am I correct? Or
yeah, I mean, he is and he isn't an originalist. This is a delicate area, I think, to understand Hamilton's thinking. He's not saying that judges or any other government officials, for that matter, should ignore the original intent, but he says at one point that the law means more than what it was intended. It means what it was intended, but it means more than that, and we can't rely solely on original intent. But that means we shouldn't ignore it.
No, that's interesting. And also it seems that there would be, for Hamilton, an underlying political theory of the Constitution that would also, everyone who's involved in both citizens but also representatives would have this understanding that there are goals, there's a structure of the Constitution, particularly separation of powers. These things are important. The Commerce Clause, ensuring for a national economy, sorts of things as well. Ask you a question about nationalism, but also the states. And so in a Tocquevillian format, the associational life. This seems to be, and you say this is a problem or just maybe a weakness in Hamilton's political philosophy. Does he seem to understand the importance of the associational life? Or, if we look at his time, obviously he thinks there's a need for the national government. I think he's right to assume new powers, to really clean up a lot of problems that are forming after the revolution in this nascent government. But does that also lead him to be blind to civil society as well?
That's another complex and interesting question, and I would start with Federalist 28 for this reason. Hamilton is at his best in recognizing the importance of intermediate structures, and especially the states, in Federalist 28, because there he provides what I would call a theory of proximity. And the theory of proximity works like this. He tells us that the closer something is to someone, the more attached they are to it. So on that way of thinking, he's telling the Anti-Federalists, you need not worry that the national government will overpower the state governments under this new Constitution because, as Madison will say later in the Federalist Papers, the first and most natural attachment to the people will be to the governments of their respective states. Why is that? Well, Hamilton gives us the theory why. Because the state governments are going to be closer to the people than the national government, and the state governments are going to take care of the vast majority of areas of governing. And for that reason, Hamilton in Federalist 28 says that it can be considered an axiom of the American Constitution that the state governments will always be adequate in protecting the liberties of the people against encroachments from the national government. So he's writing in a context that is so different from the one that we live in today that I think sometimes it's hard to understand the arguments that he's making there. The second thing I would say, though, is after the Federalist Papers have been written and Hamilton is Secretary of the Treasury in the Washington administration and later in life, he isn't as attuned, he isn't as sensitive to the needs of state governments and state and local communities as he is when writing the Federalist Papers and he's confronting the arguments of the Anti-Federalists. He slips, in my view, a little bit, and when instances occur, especially with regard to rebellions, whether it's the Whiskey Rebellion or Fry's Rebellion, Shays' Rebellion is occurring about the time when the Federalist Papers are being written, he, time and time again, tends to side with the national government. And when it comes to the Alien and Sedition Acts, although his view there is somewhat mixed and hard to classify, he sides with the national government against Kentucky and Virginia. And if ever there was a time when you might say Hamilton should not take the side of the national government and ought to take the side of the states, in a way that's perfectly consistent with Federalist 28, it should be with the Alien and Sedition Acts. But he doesn't exactly do that. He's somewhat murky on it. So his inclination is to take the side of the national government. And I think that's a weakness in his thought, but it's also why many Jeffersonians have labeled him as, the father of modern big government and welfare state, war state, all those sort of things. I don't think that's a fair characterization. I think it overstates the point. But no doubt there's a weakness there in Hamilton's thinking.
Yeah, and clearly, as I was reading the part in the Alien and Sedition Acts, of course, there is a common law question there as to what the First Amendment actually prohibited versus what it allowed. You note Hamilton tried to make some distinctions in the way it should be I think enforced against those who were violating it allegedly, and Hamilton wanted to try and hedge against a wholesale oppression of people in that. But he's trying to, it seems like there's a balance he wants to achieve, or not a balance, but he wants to make sure the national government can continue to solidify or to have the sort of respect and honor that it needs. It seems something that's instructive also is the foreign policy and the need for the young nation to not be looked at as weak and to just continually suffer the intrigues of foreign powers, particularly on the continent. And I think this is also a way to understand the political economy as well. And so it's not a nationalism of the late 19th century or the early 20th century. I think of a nationalism whereby people actually gain their primary identity in replacement of other things, culture, custom, habit, religion, etc. The nation becomes all in all. Hamilton doesn't even seem to move closer in that direction. It's really a relative comparison, I think, to the states' rights advocates. But also, it seems, the Bill of Rights. You have a nice discussion of that. But Hamilton urges that the Constitution is really a Bill of Rights, and the protections are in Article 1, Section 9. And also, with respect to the states, it's Article 1, Section 10. Which is limiting the states from using faction and their own petty interest and desires to really thwart this creating of a common market and national citizenship. And these are all parts of Hamilton that are overlooked. I guess I would be remiss if we didn't conclude the interview by talking about Jefferson and the fundamental debate they had. I wonder, we all understand the bank controversy. We understand Jefferson's, at least his direction toward agrarianism, the virtuous citizen, Hamilton, the manufacturing economy. Help us understand what's really at stake and what's driving them in this debate.
In the bank debate, remember, it's an early...
Well, I was just thinking really the fundamental questions between Hamilton and Jefferson.
Right, but let me use the bank debate to get the conversation started. With the bank debate, remember, it's an early point after the formation and implementation of the Constitution when it's not altogether clear what political conduct will look like. You can put a constitution on paper, but until you actually start walking and breathing and living that constitution, you don't know exactly how it's going to turn out. So the bank debate and those early debates between Jefferson and Hamilton and others about the role of the national government in this constitutional system are vital, I think, to shaping the view of future generations of Americans and forming the two political parties and sort of the fault lines within American politics regarding the role, the size of government. And Hamilton, I think, sometimes gets mischaracterized as the individual who is advocating more and bigger government, and Jefferson, by contrast, less government. But when you look at things like the French Revolutionary Wars and Washington and Hamilton taking the position of neutrality during those wars, and Jefferson and Madison, by contrast, trying to push the United States into the war, you get a different view of Hamilton. He did not, and neither did Washington. The farewell address, which is written by Hamilton, is a wonderfully modest argument for why the United States, as a republic, a vulnerable new republic, that's heavily in debt, should not be mingling in European affairs, should not be meddling in the affairs of other countries. It should stay relatively aloof. And on the domestic front, yes, Hamilton creates an active Treasury Department, is part of the creation of the national banking system. But at the same time, you can argue those are pretty basic and fundamental responsibilities of government. They're not the extraordinary types of things the 20th century progressives are arguing that government should do. I don't see a common pedigree, as some do, in Hamilton and 20th century progressivism. Hamilton is existing in a period of time when we've been under the Articles of Confederation. There's been a very small, extremely weak executive government. And by comparison, if you look back to the Articles, he looks like an advocate of big government. If you look forward, though, to the 20th century progressives, I think he measures up favorably in terms of somebody who's for a smaller, modest, responsible-sized government. And if you include foreign affairs in that, he looks even better.
Yeah, and it would be hard to see within Hamilton's, the way I understand it, within his constitutionalism, a justification for the administrative state that we presently have. And then to say nothing of, I mean, we can imagine what Hamilton would think of our massive transfer state, our entitlement state, and what, we think of his writings on human nature. I'm sure he would not be enthusiastic about that as well.
Yeah, that's a fair assumption.
Yeah. The administrative law, actually, I mean, if you think of, as you emphasize, Hamilton on separation of powers, the administrative law, of course, involves fundamentally a subversion of that through delegating to really a fourth branch. And in many of these departments have the ability to pass laws, interpret them, and execute them. With very little oversight. Congress has some oversight, but it's really not administered except when things go badly. So I thought that was instructive. I guess we should end really by thinking of Hamilton. Should we look at him, and maybe this is kind of a question that's funny, but we've had a rehabilitation of John Adams recently. There seems to be an attempt maybe to talk more about Madison, at least that I'm hearing. Is Hamilton someone that needs to reemerge in the national discussion about the founding and understanding our Constitution and our political order? And is that something you see your book doing?
I hope at the very least my book will get people to reconsider Hamilton first and foremost as a political thinker, as a formidable political thinker in that generation of American founders, that he deserves a higher position than he's been given by most people. And then the second thing would be that when you've been through the literature, I think you get the sense, at least I do, that Hamilton has not been given a fair shake, that he has been mischaracterized. There's this caricature of Hamilton, but we need to know more about who the real Hamilton was. And I hope my book gives readers a sense for who the real historical and theoretical Hamilton was.
Professor Federici, the book is The Political Philosophy of Alexander Hamilton. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.